story form is also just such a great tool when working with young children. They really connect and resonate with stories. And when it comes to, a story that's written for kids, it's a good chance that it's going to be written in a way that is developmentally appropriate.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Faith and Activism. Today's episode with Kayla Tychsen is actually very close to my heart as a new parent, since we talk about parenting as a powerful form of activism. It is our daily act of activism as parents and a huge responsibility. It's very important to note that Kayla is an accredited parent coach and a certified integrative trauma coach who is very passionate about empowering parents, educators, and caregivers about raising children, especially in conflict zones, as she also currently lives in Jordan but has lived in Lebanon before, including during the last war in Lebanon, and has also worked with Palestinian families. Kayla and I also discussed how, as parents, we can and we should unlearn some inherited narratives and theologies that are negative, and how to teach our children more about injustices while keeping in mind their mental health and making sure that they are resilient and protected. This is a very interesting episode that I encourage all of you to follow along and to listen to. So, without further ado, here's my episode with Kayla Tychsen. Hi, Kayla, and thank you for joining us in Across the Divide. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Abeer. I'm so happy to be here.
So, today, this is a very interesting episode where we will be talking about parenting as a form of activism. It's going to be very interesting because we're also talking to one of the very experts in the field. So, Kayla, it would be nice if we can just start briefly with maybe introducing yourself and talking a little bit about how your upbringing shaped your initial understanding of Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Kayla Tychsen, and I'm a parent coach, and I'm currently living in Jordan. And I moved to the Middle East about 11 years ago, and have lived in Jordan and lived in Lebanon for about 7 years. And I grew up in the States. I grew up in Southern California. And my parents started going to church and bringing us to church when I was about 6, 7 years old. And we started going to a really big church in our city. And that's really where my parents first started their faith journey. And that's where I was introduced to, my faith journey as a child. And there are a lot of, really positive, beautiful memories. And also, especially now looking back, knowing what I know, there was a huge emphasis on supporting Israel through prayer, but also through funding, and kind of this unconditional, this belief that we need to unconditionally support Israel and be for all the things that Israel does and says, and growing up in this environment, there was no, I don't remember there ever being discussion about Palestinians and about any of the tension within Israel. I do remember hearing that, Israel was a small, itty bitty country for God's chosen people, surrounded by Arab nations that wanted to wipe it off the face of the earth. And I remember, as I'm reading the Bible, as I'm hearing Sunday school stories and hearing about Israel and about God's chosen people and the things that God did for them and through them. I remember kind of thinking like, well, that makes sense. I guess, why wouldn't we support Israel? These were obviously important. This was an important nation and important people to God in the scriptures. And so why would it be any different now? Obviously, not having any understanding of the history. So, um, my first knowledge, my first understanding that there were even such people as Palestinians was as an adult in my early 20s when I met a young woman from Jordan in the US whose family was Palestinian. And that really was kind of this first, it was really eye-opening just hearing another perspective. And so I would say, that's really when these cracks started to occur in this theology that I grew up with and that was really foundational for me and really beautiful in a lot of ways, but at the same time, really problematic.
Yeah. So this is one of the stories where we understand that it was all based on a personal experience, and it's, I think, also another part of what makes it special. So, what would you say that actually helped you begin the process of unlearning theological and political narratives that you inherited as a child? Because we know how difficult that is, and now that you are an accredited parent coach and an integrative trauma coach, knowing all of how upbringing and childhood affects who we are and how difficult it is to unlearn what we inherited.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is absolutely through relationships that I started to question the narrative that I was raised in. And, particularly this one friend that would invite me into her home and cook me these elaborate meals, and we just had so many beautiful conversations. But I remember hearing her story and the story of her family, being told that they had to evacuate, that they could come back in a few days once things calmed down and everything was safe, and then never being allowed to go back to their home again. And I do remember this internal feeling of that's not right. But at the same time, I still had this skewed understanding of the situation. And so, I am so sad and embarrassed to say it now, but I remember, hearing her story, but trying to justify why Israel might have done that. And why they were, still God's chosen people and why we still needed to support them. But I would say that was a huge, there was a huge step forward in the direction of, building more relationships, hearing more stories, and really starting to pull apart that theology. And so I think the next really big experience for me was going on a Holy Land tour with a Palestinian tour guide. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I got to see a side of the Holy Land that I think so many people don't get to see. I talked with my mom after that tour, and she was shocked to hear that we went to Bethlehem. And when we went to Bethlehem with our Palestinian tour guide, it was beautiful and wonderful, and we visited the Christmas church where Jesus was born. We visited, the caves near the church and sat in the caves as we read the story of the birth of Jesus. We walked the streets in Bethlehem. We visited the shops of Palestinian shopkeepers. And it was just such a beautiful experience. And then with absolutely no fear, I want to add, but sharing that story later with people like my mom and other people that had been on Holy Land tours and were told things like, oh, we can't go to those areas because it's unsafe. And just a completely different picture painted about Palestinians than what I experienced firsthand in, so many different places in the Holy Land. And so, even just comparing stories that really made an impact on me, that even people that visited this place didn't actually have the opportunity to see it for what it is. And there's still this, picture painted about Arabs, about Palestinians that is just, not true. And so I'm so grateful for my experience. And then I think it was the next year that I moved to Jordan to volunteer with an NGO. And I lived with a Palestinian family. And I also volunteered. The people that I volunteered with, many of them were Palestinian as well. And so there were just these conversations that naturally came up, especially in that first year with these people that I developed such close relationships with. I mean, these people were my language teachers, my cultural guides. They were my second family here, in that first Christmas that I'm spending away from my own family. These families invited me in to their family gatherings and just included me and made me a part of their families. And so, having these deep relationships and knowing them so intimately, being inspired by their faith, and then hearing the really deep pain that they had, from injustice, and even more than, or maybe equally as painful as the injustice, I think, was the denial of the injustice from the world and from the Christian community in the West. And so I think that was really profound for me and made a huge impact on just reshaping my understanding of the scriptures and really being able to see the scriptures for what they are instead of reading them with a Zionist lens. And so when I actually read the scriptures, it actually became really clear that God's plan for Israel was to bring Jesus and bring the world into his chosen people, his family. And so I think it was just really profound to actually have such close relationships with these brothers and sisters in Christ who love Jesus and also feel discounted by their Western brothers and sisters.
Have you dreamed of traveling to Palestine, Israel? Of learning on the ground from folks that you've learned from afar from for so long? Friends, now is the opportunity. Join Across the Divide for a special delegation in May 2026. We will be traveling as a community to participate in the Christ at the Checkpoint conference at Bethlehem Bible College, hearing from leaders and theologians and scholars that we've been learning from and who you've probably heard on the podcast for a number of years. We'll get to encounter them and learn from them in person and begin to build community together with Palestinians, with Israelis, with those who have committed their lives to the transformative work of nonviolent resistance, of peace building, and of resistance in the face of occupation. This trip will include a 5-day tour after Christ at the Checkpoint, where we'll go throughout the West Bank and Israel, meeting world-renowned theologians, church leaders, activists, and communities facing acute threats. We'll spend time in the South Hebron Hills. We'll get to worship and witness at Tent of Nations Farm. We'll make pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Nazareth, and the Galilee. We'll meet and learn from Palestinian Christian communities in Taibe, in Jaffa, and elsewhere. Friends, we invite you to sign up, to say yes to the trip and experience of a lifetime. From May 25th to June 4th, 2026, check out Across the Divide social media and our website for more information on how to register.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also very strange for us when we hear that many people come on a Holy Land tour and yet they don't visit, Palestinian cities that are very important to the whole story of nativity and to the places that where actually, Jesus lived. And it's basically part of the faith though. So it's still not unusual, and that's really odd that it's still happening today. And sometimes it's a matter of your tour guide that you get to get a different experience of the tour. But Kayla, this is we can say, I believe, that the time that you spent on this tour and also living in Jordan and meeting Palestinian families firsthand were actually what helped reshape your understanding of faith, as you're saying. It's not only, theology, not only politics in general, but also theology and faith. And it's really very powerful. So moving to parenting as daily activism, as we'd like to call it. Let's start as a parent. Let's start not as a parent coach, but as a parent yourself. How do you work on try to root your parenting in love, in justice, in empathy, especially that you're an American family currently living in Jordan with different, your kids listening to different stories, meeting different people, and maybe coming up with different questions every day. So how do you actually deal with that as a parent?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I would say it's done with so much intention and so much prayer. We are constantly, praying and asking the Lord how He would have us invest in our children, and also know His love for them and know their identity. And then also how they can better know God's love for others, for the people around them. And I would say there's a lot of things that we do, practices that we have in the home. Listening to God's voice is one that's very important for us. But there's all of these small moments that are really what shape our children. And ultimately, our children absorb who we are. They absorb our attitudes, they absorb our beliefs, even ones we aren't aware of. And so much of the work of parenting really is our own inner work. And it really is, it's healing. It's engaging God in healing. And so I think, our own biases, right? Really evaluating what kinds of beliefs and biases we do have from our own childhoods, and if that is appropriate, if those things are actually true, or if they need to be replaced by God's truth. And so I think, that's a huge priority for us. But, there's so many interactions every day that really are opportunities for our children to develop empathy, to develop assertiveness. And so, just some ways that we do those kinds of things are really helping our children to be able to say no, and being able to say what they don't like, being able to say what they need. And also really helping our children understand where the other is coming from, right? Sibling arguments, sibling, rivalry, or sibling squabbles are such great opportunities to actually develop these ideas that are so much bigger and that actually really do go beyond, just that sibling relationship. And so I think that is so key. All of these small moments every day are so important, but then it's also so important that our children are seeing us care for the poor. That we're not just saying that, God tells us to love people and God tells us to, love for the poor, but they're actually seeing us do that on a daily basis. And they're invited to join to whatever, level they're comfortable with. So yeah, I would say those are some of the ways that we bring this dynamic into our home, into our parenting. Really even just reevaluating kids Bible stories, the way that children are often given a simplified gospel. That all, to me, also really matters and makes a difference in this kind of situation when we're talking about Israel Palestine, when we're talking about these global conflicts. I think, for there's so much tied up in our theology and how that plays out in our parenting. Like, one thing that's just popping into my head now is this idea of the wrath of God punishing his son because he needed to punish someone. And I think that when we have this understanding, when this is the main understanding of who God is, it honestly makes sense that a nation would fund bombs for, millions of civilians, because we're viewing people and the world and God through this lens of violence. And so I think, one of the things that we've really come to is, just what the scripture says. Jesus's teachings on who God is and who he invites us to be when he's living in us and when we're following him. And I think, the Beatitudes are such an amazing example of that. So I don't know how much, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but yes, I think that when you really get into the theology, it does impact our parenting, and then that does impact our children's worldview and how they view other people, how they view their role in the world. So
Definitely. Thank you, Kayla, for these tips as well. As parents, we always struggle with these questions and always trying to do as we're taught, always trying to do as the Bible tells us, but living in a place where it's one crisis after another, living in fear. I can even tell from my personal experience that, like, my husband and I always, like, we were praying and asking whether it's really a good idea to bring a child into this world at this time. And I know that many young couples also have this question, simply because our reality is something that changes every second. Everything can be different the next morning, so it's a very scary topic for parents, and as new parents, always wondering, in this world, full of fear of destruction, full of oppression, racism, in our place here also occupation. What does it mean to actually raise a child with the correct values that we want them to inherit and to have?
so we were in Lebanon last summer and fall, and really, well, and even when October 7th happened, we were in Lebanon. And really, the last several years, there's just been different waves of tension and extra stress, in terms of conflict with Israel in particular, not including all the other things that Lebanon has experienced in the last several years, but specifically increased stress related to Israel. And, are they going to invade? Are they going to bomb? What is this going to look like? And so last summer and last fall, tensions were higher than they had ever been. And everyone, like, you could just feel it in the country. Everyone was living at extremely heightened nervous system states, and that really shows up for parents in reactivity towards their children. And in a lot of ways, that's just so natural and normal, when we're under so much stress that we're at capacity, and these small interactions with our children just can put us over the top sometimes. And so my heart during that season was really to walk alongside these parents to complete the stress cycle, to make sure that in these times of increased stress, they had practices to be able to release that stress in healthy ways. Because when it does build and build, like, that gets stored in our bodies if it's not released. And then it gets released on our children or on our spouse. And so during that time, I got to do workshops with moms. I coached moms, and really just provided this community of support, and encouragement, and so much grace, because it is, I mean, being a perfect parent is impossible no matter where you are in the world. But when you're literally afraid of, bombs, that just is a whole nother, brings it to a whole nother level. So, having these practices to release stress through movement of the body was so important. And just an example of what this looked like on a daily basis. There was one point where, well, for a long time, Israeli jets were breaking the sound barrier over Beirut. And there was one time when my kids were playing outside in the backyard, and the jets broke the sound barrier. I mean, it when that happened, like I didn't even have a context for that kind of feeling of fear. And I had just walked outside with them and was outside with them. But this just reverberation in the body that you don't even feel in control of your own body for those few seconds, but those few seconds, just time slows down. And so in that moment, of course, my children were absolutely terrified. And immediately we went inside the house because Israeli jets always fly in pairs. So if there's one sonic boom, there's probably going to be a second. And so we went inside the house and we immediately connected, and, they were like clinging to me. And we, we just kind of sat there kind of in shock. And then I was like, we need to move our bodies. Like, you could just feel the energy coursing through our bodies. And I was like, we need to move. We need to release all this stress and tension and energy. And so we turned on some dance music and we all danced. We had a family dance party. We danced so hard until literally we were laying on the floor. And it's really interesting and really beautiful, because a situation that caused so much fear in the moment, because we were able to release that stress and also have this connection and this fun in a way. My children look back at that and they like laugh about it and almost have this sense of like, what they remember is that feeling of connection and family that we had after that. And so they actually look at that memory as like a fond memory, which is just so wild to me in so many ways. But I think it just shows the importance of being able to release the stress, because living under the tension and there's different kinds of stress. There's the underlying tension that's always present. And it's kind of like a frog in boiling water too. As the tension increases, the stress increases, but you almost don't even realize that it's there and that it's happening. And then there are these moments of fear, these moments of additional, stress and fear. And so there really needs to be practices that we have every day of releasing stress and calming the nervous system for that underlying tension. But then in these more like acute, stressful moments, there needs to be, just this movement in that moment, and this releasing of energy and connection.
Yeah, it's very interesting how much stress can actually like consume of us, of our thoughts, of our feelings, of the way also we treat our children. If us as parents do not get the chance to release the stress, then it's going to affect our children and the way they have these memories of us. And this also reminded me like the whole idea of just releasing stress, no matter what you do, whether you dance, whether you just do anything. It just reminded me of testimony I once read maybe a year ago to someone from Gaza who was saying that before, like not during wars, when we are stressed, we would go out, we would fish because people of Gaza really love the sea. So we would go fish. We would either go running just on the beach or, making sure our feet touch the sand and, get all the energy. And now all of us are in this one tent that we can't actually, go out to do anything, not even run, not even fish, not even talk to our friends. But what we're doing as a family is that we're holding hands and we're praying. And this is another point of no matter what you believe in or what kind of thing you try to do, as long as you're doing it with the people you love, and as long as you're trying as much as possible. And he's also a parent. That's why I remember this whole story, that he was telling that it actually made his children calm down after hours of crying, because they were afraid of the bombs, of the explosions they're hearing. And when they saw that their parents are now calm, they also calmed down. So this is just like I'm sharing this as a reminder to all of us as parents to try as much as possible. I know it's hard, and we all live under different conditions. And even now, after like a ceasefire agreement is signed, we all know that nothing is over. So sometimes we don't like have the privilege to do this or that, but even one small act that maybe just holding hands and breathing in, breathing out can actually make a difference. And I like this from the message that you shared. So Kayla, do you think that there are maybe tips or strategies that, I know every case is different as we're saying, but basically like tips or strategies that you would share with parents, other than trying to release stress, but basically maybe to help nurture critical thinking and empathy in our children, so that it also contributes to them handling fear and living in crisis, and even dealing, even for those who don't live in the region, but everyone has their own crisis and conflict. So are there like any, maybe, I don't know, 3 strategies that you as an experienced parent coach would say that try these with your children to help you in such situations?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think both of those things are so important. Critical thinking is so important. Being able to question, to think for ourselves, to really dig deeper behind just what we're told to believe is such an important skill to teach our kids. And then obviously empathy is such an important skill. And I would say for the critical thinking, a lot of this really comes down to, I think oftentimes as parents, we feel like we need to save our children from struggle and do things for our children that they want to do for themselves. And The reason why I think this in particular is so important is because when we step in and do the things for our child that they can do and want to do, it really robs them of the experience of learning and of discovering and of trying hard things and not getting it and failing and then trying some more and persevering and pushing through and then finally succeeding. And so I'm talking about like starting at the smallest level. And oftentimes, a child will turn 1.5, 2, 2.5, and they want to be the one to put on their own shoes. They want to put on their own shirt. They want to put on their own pants. And they want to do things on their own. They want to try and struggle and do things for themselves. And this, we might, it might be hard to see the connection between this and critical thinking, but I think the connection is that when we give our children the opportunity to struggle and to push through frustration, we're teaching them how to learn on their own instead of spoon feeding them everything. And instead of them relying on us for all the right answers or relying on a person for all, for what to believe and for all the right answers. Instead, they really do need to be able to know how to learn, how to struggle through a situation that they might even not quite have the skills for yet, but it's through the struggle that they actually develop the skills. And so I think, as our kids get older too, when they do come to us with questions, it does look like talking through their questions with them and not necessarily just Googling the answer immediately. We do want to invite that problem solving. We do want to ask them, what do you think? What do you think is the answer to that question? Where can we find more information? And so I think that is really key. And then, also along that lines, another thing that comes to my mind is there's this mentality that was very prevalent in our parents' generation that was, I want first time obedience. I do have all the right answers as as the parent. I do have all the right answers. This is the only option, and there's no negotiating. And really, this authoritarian style of parenting also robs children from developing some of the skills of critical thinking, problem solving, and intrinsic motivation. If they're just afraid, if they're just choosing to do something or not to do something just because they're afraid of the punishment, then that's really not teaching them how to make choices in the real world when there are some grays and the parent isn't going to be right there telling them exactly what to do and when to do it. They really do need to learn how to make those decisions. And so coming alongside our kids and helping them problem solve when there is conflict between siblings, helping them to make that right with each other, helping them, asking them to give us ideas on how we should move forward in a situation. Not to go into too much detail here, but for instance, a few weeks ago, my daughter was So they have a candy box and they bring all their candy they get from school or whatever, put it in the box. And then on Friday, they get to pick one and have a piece of candy on Fridays. And there was a day that my daughter, I caught her taking candy from her candy box. And I know what my parents would have probably done in that situation, but I was very intentional with how I wanted to handle that. And I did not want there to be any shame or any anger, but I did want to find out what was behind that choice to take candy from the candy box when it wasn't, she knows very well that that was not a time to have that candy. And so we talked through these things and really got to the heart of things. And then I asked her how she thought we should handle this situation. And that, we talked about how it was a little bit hard for her, that the candy was in the box and the box was in her reach. And she was kind of having some hard days at school, and that just felt a little bit too, tempting for her. And so her idea was to put the candy up higher. And then her idea was that she had her candy for that week. And so when that Friday came around, she already had her candy. So she wasn't going to have a piece on Friday. And so anyways, that's just a small example of what it looks like to really partner with our kids in this critical thinking, this decision making, this repair, instead of being instead of coming with punishment, with judgment, with blame, with anger, and trying to scare our kids into obedience, because usually that doesn't work well. So that is a little bit about critical thinking. I think empathy, there's, so many ways to cultivate empathy, but I think the biggest one is them experiencing empathy from us. If our children experience empathy and experience someone entering their world and really wanting to understand what they're thinking, what they're feeling, that does something in them that then gives them that empathy for others. And I think just along this topic, I know that we all really want to raise children that do know the struggle that Palestinians have been facing, and that see what's happening, that and that, like, specifically in this situation, we want our children to have empathy for the people in Gaza right now. And so I think, I shared some strategies for kind of developing these skills kind of in our everyday parenting, but specifically when it comes to the situation in Israel and Gaza. I think that, it does really take wisdom, because, and I think it is very important to tell our children what's happening. I think that is essential. Also, we are our child's protector. And so we also don't want to go to the other extreme of exposing our children to violence because their brains are not developmentally ready for that. And so I think being very being very protective of what our children watch, what they listen to, and this goes beyond just information and videos about Gaza in particular. But when we're talking about any TV show, any movie, any game, there shouldn't be violence in that. We really do need to be protecting our children's minds from violence, because that does rewire their brains for a lack of empathy. And so actually, I think sometimes, and I felt this too, we want our kids so bad to know what's happening and be educated, and we see all these children who should not be exposed to violence and are living in violence day in and day out, and it feels just so unjust and unfair that our children are safe when there's so many children that aren't. And so I've talked to people who I know they feel this tension. And of course, they want their children to know what's happening. But at the same time, developing empathy does require us to protect our children's developing brains. And so being able to tell them about what's going on and be honest, but also not expose them to things that they're not ready for. And it is a hard line, and obviously it's going to depend on the age of the child, how much you're going to tell them, and how much they do really need to know, and what are the things that they're not ready for yet. But I would say a really big key in this is giving children something to do about it. Giving children something that they can do. When we see injustice, our brains are wired to be able to, they're wired with a need to be able to do something about the injustice. And so helping our children to mobilize and to be able to, whether it's calling representatives, writing letters, those kinds of things are just so important.
Definitely. That was exactly the thing that we've heard many parents talking about, that how exactly do I tell my children about what's happening. And as you said, this is very age sensitive. What you tell a 4-year-old is very different from what you tell a 14-year-old who maybe have already seen these images through social media, which are everywhere. And the way that or she, in this case, the way the 14-year-old would act is very different from the way the 4-year-old, who might they both might face fear, and the whole feeling of injustice can be it's a burden that not many of us can actually handle. And here comes, as you said, the parents. Okay, what do I do? And your children are younger than 10, right?
Yeah, I
So
have a 5-year-old and a 6.5-year-old.
how did you tell them, for example, if we can just give a short example of maybe the right words to use, as in, there's always a way of telling about what kind of words can we actually use to tell our children about this when they're, let's say, maybe younger than 10 and older than 10 in this case, just for the distinction.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think the process for us, it was a process to figure out how we wanted to tell them. I guess first even to figure out if we wanted to tell them, and then to figure out how, and then over the years it's evolved as they've changed, as we've had different experiences. And so after October 7th, a couple weeks later, we had to evacuate Lebanon, and we went to Europe for several weeks. And I really struggled in this time. This was personally this was when we were all just, I think, shocked at seeing what was happening in Gaza, and seeing it, it was as we were first, I think, seeing a war or a genocide being broadcast over social media. And we were personally impacted in that we had to evacuate. And I just remember such a feeling of like hopelessness and despair, and really just wondering like how, we do travel a lot. And so when we first told our children that we were leaving, we made it fun. We said we're going to we're going to Greece. We're gonna go and see sights, and we're gonna go and do this and that. And that seemed like pretty normal for them at the time. But as things progressed, there was this like deep, and it was probably obvious to my children too that like something wasn't right inside of me. Even though there was kind of this outer like attitude of like, let's make it fun and let's, go on an adventure. But there came a point when one morning my daughter woke up and said that she had a dream. And again, she like has not been exposed to, even games that are about shooting and guns and these kinds of like, these are all things that we have just personally kept out of our home. And so she shared with me this dream that she had about this like big vehicle driving across the sand, and then it put a box in the ground, and that box erupted like a volcano. And to me, I was kind of shocked, because in my mind, what she was describing was a bomb and like a tank, but she just didn't have the vocabulary to say it. And we prayed about that dream and what God wanted to show her through that. And we really sensed that God wanted to invite her and both of our kids into praying for Gaza and the people of Gaza. And so, we shared some of the situation. Again, we didn't want to instill fear, especially since we were living in Lebanon at that time and had evacuated. But we did share about some of the things that had happened. And obviously, or I think at that point, they hadn't experienced the sonic boom of the jet. I think that was later. But yeah, anyways, we would spend time praying for Gaza as a family, and we would spend time, and they, of course, did have a lot of questions, because to a child, these things really are black and white. Like, you don't hurt children. You don't
Exactly.
hurt people. And so there's really simple, I think children actually really get it with just very simple ways of talking about it and explaining it. We don't have to go into a ton of detail. And I think depending on like how close people are to the situation, they're going to share differently. But yeah, that was kind of this first step in really sharing some of these things with our kids and really inviting them into prayer and then also into forms of activism. They would decorate posters and put them up around our neighborhood when we were in Texas later, and just giving them this opportunity to tell people about what they knew was right and to stand for innocent people that were being wronged. So, and again, like we didn't give them all the information at once. There were initial conversations, and then they'd come and have questions and ask, different things, and we'd have different conversations. So it is hard to like boil it down to like a couple sentences of like, say this to your kid. But one thing that we bought a book. I can't remember the name of the book, but I think if you like search on Amazon, Sita's Bird or Sita's Gift, maybe. I think it might be Sita's Bird, but it's the story of this young girl in Gaza. And so that was like another opportunity to share more information and story form is also just such a great tool when working with young children. They really connect and resonate with stories. And when it comes to, a story that's written for kids, it's a good chance that it's going to be written in a way that is developmentally appropriate. And so, that book brought up more questions, more conversation, and just a reminder, every time we'd read the book about what was happening, about how we can be praying for Palestinians, for Gazans. So yeah, it's hard to give a very specific like couple lines to say, but I think that should give people ideas of how to start the conversation. And I would say the most important thing for any age child is we want to be the source of their information. And so if they do come to us with questions, we want to answer honestly. We want to make sure that we're welcoming these questions, that there's no wrong questions, especially as kids get older and they are, in conversations with friends at school, or they do have a phone and can, see content. Like, we want to be their source of information. And we also want to tell our kids the effects of watching those kinds of things. They might stumble across it. They might even seek it out because, they are curious or because they, feel burdened. But also, being a place of information where we can also help our children to, if we are their source of information, then they might be less likely to, find that information on their own elsewhere.
Makes sense. Thank you, Kayla, for all of this. So, just like trying to summarize, as unfortunately our time has come to an end, but basically, what matters most is we lead by example. We as parents will try as much as possible to show the kids and project what and how to deal with this, telling them exactly that this is injustice, that this is something that we should oppose to, but at the same time, not showing them the pictures, the images of violence. As you mentioned, of course, when they're older, they're going to see everything on their own, but at least while we're still responsible for protecting them from all of this, it's our responsibility. This is all kind of, affirmations also for us, and tips to go and buy and to use, especially in our world today. So I really want to thank you. If you have any final remarks, tips, ideas, anything, we'd definitely like to hear them. And thank you again for your time and for all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I am so grateful to just have this conversation with you. And this is a topic that's so dear to my heart, and I'm just grateful to be able to hear your heart and a little bit of your story, and really, this topic is just so incredibly important. Not to me, not only because I live in this region and have experienced the effects of this region, but ultimately this situation, especially with social media, the way that it is, the injustice that's happening in Gaza right now is impacting the whole world. Whether, however close or not close we are to this situation, this is having an impact on the whole world. And so I'm just honored to be a part of the conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Banura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abeer. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.